I'm recording. Okay. So let's just give a brief recap. We were talking first of all about, and in previous memory we've been talking about the inyonim of Esesvidus agnuzois, but the Esesvidus agnuzois are gnuzois, and the only way that they can actually become recognizable, so to speak, is after the tzimtzum and the division of the various spheroids into their various categories, moichin, midas, and so on and so forth. Then they come into hislabshus in kalim, in the kalim of Atzilus, and we spoke at some length about the concept of hislabshus and how hislabshus is itself an inyan of tzimtzum. In other words, the inyan of hislabshus is that the oiros now take upon themselves the quality of the kli. It's true that the or that's malubish in the kli in the first place is an or of chesed, is only going to generally go into a kli of chesed, but now the chesed in the kli is going to have a hashpah on the or. It's going to matamtem the or, and it's going to be malbish the or to the extent that that or is able to now be yored umisma'it. It's going to descend and become reduced considerably. This is what gives the various spheroids, the spheroids as a whole, the concept of Mila and Mata, that the spheres in which there's more or is going to be the inyan of Mila, which is generally the concept of Moichin. In Moichin itself, Chochma more than Bina. But in any event, there's an inyan of Moichin and there's an inyan of Midois. Moichin is obviously going to be higher than the Midois because there's more oil in them. And in the Midois themselves, there's also going to be different madrigas because the or of Chesed is obviously Chesed Kel Kol Hayoim. It's shaykh to the inyan of oil. Masha Enken Gvura is the inyan already of Tzimtzum. And so it goes on down all the various spheroids, and there is an inyan of tzimtzum and reduction. So in order to be able to explain this a little bit better, the Rebbe brings, as is often done in Hasidus, or in fact this is mostly this is what is done in Hasidus, he brings a moshol from kochos hanefesh. And to explain the difference, for example, between midois and moichin. Moichin is the focus on the inyan, not a focus on the person, but a focus on the inyan. If we're talking about mitzad kochos hanefesh, in other words, the inyan of chokhmah, the inyan of bina, would focus primarily on what the concept is and how the concept can be understood. In other words, the inyonim and the masholim that are going to explain that etzem concept from chokhmah, how they're going to explain that, there will be an inyan of bina, and that's how the inyan of moichin works. Masha Einkan, the inyan of midois, the inyan of midois is Hagoshas Atzmoy. Essentially, all midas are an inyan of Hergesh Atzmoy, and ultimately the reason for that is because all midos stem from the inyan of Olam HaToihu, which is an inyan of Hargoshas Atzmoy. And the Rebbe here, the Rebbe Rashab, does bring a concept of that you have midos atzmiyim. Yeah, and those midos atzmiyim are not really midos, they're bechinus in ratzoin. For instance, he brings, for example, the inyan of ahava. There's an ahava which is ahava atzmis, but it's not. He says explicitly that it's actually not a midah, even though it looks like it's the inyan of a midah because it's called ahava. Nevertheless, it's actually the inyan of ratzoin. It's not the inyan of a midah at all. And whereas a midah always focuses on the inyan of ma tov li, like what's good for me, because it's margishus atzma, a person's margishus atzma, that's the inyan of midois, and therefore the inyan of midois is the inyan of metzias. It's toifes makoim and so on and so forth. Masha einkein ratzoin is toifes in the etzem. It's not toifes in my inyonim, it's toifes in the inyonim of etzem, atzmius. And that's the way it is in Ruchnius as well. All of this, and we're going to go on for the rest of this chapter, essentially, is all a moshol to be able to understand the inyonim in the Or Ein Sof and the Tzimtzum and the spheres of Chochmah and so on, the spheres of Atzilus and so on. But in any event, I hope we'll finish this chapter today because we've been going on this chapter. It's already the third. third lesson on this chapter, so we're going to go quite fast, but I hope we'll finish. Therefore, it's possible because when we're talking about the inyan of ahava atzmis, which is ahava of the bechina of ratzoin, it's not really the midah of ahava; it's an inyan in ratzoin. So yachol liyo is ratzon gam kshelo yesh ahava. You can have the inyan of ratzoin that does not have ahava associated with it at all. K'mo ba'avas ha'av uben. Like, for instance, the love of a father and a child, a father and a son. When the son is not as he should be, there's no revealed ahava in the father for his child because his child is doing the wrong thing. But nevertheless, there's still a kesher, right? The kesher atzmi, the ratzoin, is still there. Right? He wants his child, and he wants his child to be kadaboy as he should be, as is good for him. Not as is good for the father, but as good for the child. Obviously, that's part of chinuch. That's the way it has to be. He wants his son, and he wants his son to have it good, and therefore, obviously, wants him to do the right things. In any event, the kain hu hadugma l'mayla. The same thing is true up above. Tichsif, as it is written, va'avgam zois. Even though Bnei Israel might not be in exactly the right place and so on and so forth, and they're not doing the right things, nevertheless, I didn't despise them, I didn't reject them completely. Ga'altim means I wasn't disgusted with them, essentially. In other words, even though Bnei Israel might not be doing the right thing, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't show his love, his galus, but nevertheless, Loma asked him, I didn't despise him. He didn't disgust me. I'm just trying to get him back, Bnei Israel, onto the right derech. As Chazal tell us, ben kach ben kach bonai heim. Whether I like it or not, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, whatever the situation that they're in, bonai heim, they're still my children. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to treat Bnei Israel as Bnei Israel. They're his children. Whether they're doing the right thing or they're not doing the right thing. Nevertheless, it's just a matter of whether ahava is galus or not is galus, but it is still there. V'hainu b'haratzon. In other words, bonai heim. Where are they bonai? B'haratzon. Shezeu v'bnei shu atzmusum husoy. That's because Bnei Israel is mi atzmusum hus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not only, in other words, not only are we a chelik elokam imam mamash, in other words, a chelik that is l'choira separated from the klal. That's not, in fact, the case. It's mamash chelik elokai that's always attached up above, and it's attached to Bnei Israel. It was attached, no matter what their situation. B'chitzonius latz musa u'mehusay. But when it comes to the midah of Ava, not Ava or Ratzain, but Ava, Stam Ava, the midah of Ava, the emotional quality of Ava, it depends on reasons. In other words, if a person has a reason to love somebody, then that will be expressed. Otherwise, probably it won't. And it depends on how he feels. In other words, if that relationship is li toiv, if it's good for me, then I'll feel ahava. If it's not good for me, I'll feel more yira and I'll run away from it. Right? If I feel ahava, I'm going to be drawn towards it because it's good for me too. And the same thing that we could analyze all of the midos in the same way. Right? The person feels himself. In other words, what he feels in the other, what he relates to the other person is essentially an inyan in himself. The other person is simply a mirror to a certain extent for himself. That's the inner the midos, and that's why the midos can be actually transformed from minakotza lakotza very suddenly. If a person was of the opinion that yes, the other person loves me and I love them or whatever, and then suddenly it's misguided that's not the case. Chas v'sholom, what could happen? Because midos are an inyan of hergesh atzmi. In other words, I feel myself. And when all of a sudden I become aware of the fact that what I'm feeling is not what I thought I was feeling, or there's a reason for me not to feel that anymore, it can result in tremendous rage and anger and so on and so forth, whatever. Let's not get into the psychology of these things. He's merely using this as a as a paradigm to be able to understand what goes on up above. So let's go a little bit weiter. There's a difference between moichin and midas. Why? Because moichin is matun, right? Moichin are focused on the inyan, what the inyan is. But mido is focused on how it relates to me, what my inyan is in this, how it relates to me, what's for me in this inyan. That's the inyan of midos. So the hefresh ben moichin midas, the moichin hemichin is bittel v'heder heger shatzmusay. When it comes to moichin, he doesn't feel himself. He's not aware of himself, as you probably know. There's many stories about the Rebbeim as well. But even in the secular realm, a person could sit for hours and hours trying to figure out a concept and not even realize that time has passed. There's no hergesh atzmusay. In other words, he didn't realize he was hungry, he's tired, and so on and so forth. And when either the Indian becomes clear to him or something disturbs his thought patterns, and he suddenly realizes, I've been thinking about this thing for the last 10 hours, and look what happened. The day's already over. And now he suddenly realizes, right? All this time, it was bebechinas heder hergesh atzmusay. He didn't feel himself at all. He wasn't involved in it. He was focused on the Indian completely. Because the whole Indian Amoichin generally is to attach the Amoichin, to think about something that's up above. In other words, it's an abstract and mufshat kind of a thing, and therefore I'm focusing on something that's stripped away from my personal experience. My mind is into that thing, and it's got nothing to do with how I feel about anything. And therefore, Shezeu Poel Bittul Mitzius Atzmoy causes the person to come to the Indian of Bittul, to a feeling of self-negation. He's not aware of himself. He doesn't see himself in the picture. He only sees the Indian. And of course, this is the Indian of his boinus. That's one of the ways to bring about the Indian of Bittul of the Nefesh of Bahamas, as he'll explain. It's to be misboinen in Yonim, in Inyonim of Seichel. This is in general the Derech of Chabad, but he's going to also point out that don't think you can misaken the Nefesh of Bahamas only through Moichin. You can't, because the Nefesh of Bahamas is Midas itself, and therefore you have to work on the Indian of Midas. He's going to speak about that soon. Midas is Hergesh Atzmoy, whereas Midos are not Bitul Atzmoy, but Hergesh Atzmoy Tafkan, the opposite. And therefore the Gilu in Midas is much less than the Gilu in Moichin. Now you might argue and say that the Rad Tvuas v'Koach Shoyer and the Midas are much more motivating than Seichel. It's true, they are, but they're only motivating in a certain sense. The oil in them is much less. The regesh in them is much more. The oil in Seichel is much greater, but it's mufshat. It's not necessarily shaykh to me. It's not part of my metzias. It's away from my metzias, so to speak, and therefore it's a much more mufshat and abstract thing. Okay, that's why moichin is shalit alalei b'teva. When you see the good in something, it's not only what's good for me, but you see the good in an abstract way first. That's in the moichin. He explains, he only sees the etzem good of the Indian, not what's good for me. Lo mashelo tov. He sees the wondrousness of this thing and how it's so special and important, so on and so forth. And that's why it has, that's the intellectual part of it. The emotional part of it is, how's it good for me? So when it comes into midas, then the calculation, the cheshbon is, how's it good for me? What's in it for me? How do I feel about this? Well, how does it impact my life, right? The my is the inyan of the midas. And even when you talk about hasagas tovadavar, it's only the outer aspect of moichin that really is margish the toiv hadavar. The the goodness of this thing, because goodness is, even though it's more of an abstract thing, it's not yet good for what's good for me, it's more of an abstract goodness. Nevertheless, it's closer towards the inyan midas than pure moichin. You might call it the midas sheba moichin. So what's the ikar inyan of moichin? Therefore, you might call this the inyan of midas moichin, the chitzonis moichin. The toiv of the inyan is the chitzonis moichin. Mashenka and the abstract inyan, completely abstract, that's the moichin itself. That's mufshat. The moichin be'etzem hen rak hasogas etzem hadavar v'lo es hatoiv shel hadavar. It's the conceptual inyan rather than how it's good for me. Now, it's much easier to think about this in scientific terms, for example, right? Let's say you're thinking about the inyan of, I don't know, E equals mc squared, Einstein's famous formula for relativity. Now, there's no inyan of my personal hergesh in E equals mc squared, I don't think anyway, right? Or when you're thinking of the inyan of black holes. Black holes have got nothing to do with me. Black holes out there in the universe or whatever it is, and whatever it is and however it is, it doesn't impact me. I don't think of it like that. So therefore, I could think of it in a completely abstract way that has nothing to do with my life, and it's not going to change my life in any way, even if I understand it perfectly. I understand what a black hole is. I understand what relativity, quantum physics. It's not going to impact my daily life in any way, right? It's mufshat, it's seichel. There's no inyan of midas in it at all. As he just said, Rak Mashu Masik Etzema Inyan. He's only grasps the etzem of this concept. It's a conceptual thing. But the concept of how, or grasping rather intellectually, how this inyan is good. In other words, he has his spalus in the moyach. In other words, his spalus in the moyach is already in inyan of midois in the moyach, because the midois are what comes to his spalus. His spalus means emotional arousal, essentially, right? His spalus. That's only in the midois of the moichin, not in the etzem moichin. Right? He's talking there still about the inyan of hasogas atoiv. Midois, that's hasogas atoiv. In other words, it's still an inyan in moichin. But when it comes to midas, then it comes to hergesh atzmai. Midas ba hahergesh ech shaloi tov. How it's good for me. Ech shaloi tov hadavar. And therefore a person can get aroused to love the thing and move towards it, or fear the thing, run away from it, and so on and so forth. We can understand this from by way of an inyan of avodah. When a person is misboinen in an inyan eloki, in other words, he meditates on some divine concept, and he thinks deeply into it, the inyan eloki illuminates his moichin. Now, this is he's telling us over here in one sentence basically what the whole inyan of his boinanus is. The inyan of his boinanus is to delve into an inyan eloki, so that it's meir b'moicha. It mamish lights up your brain, so to speak. Mashinish ar b'midois, and that effect it has, and what's left over for the midois, urak ma shekirvas elokim litoiv. It's not the etzem elokus, it's not the inyan eloki, it's only the chitonistic inyan, the kirvas elokim loitoiv. And Dafka, the posuk uses the name Elokim rather than the name Havaya, because when it's the inyan ner Havaya nishmas Adam, that's the oir of the neshama, and here when we're talking about the inyan of midois and hergesh, then the name Elokim is used. Why? Because the inyan of tzimtzum, the midois are tzimtzum l'gavei moichin. So the moichin disappears to a certain extent, or becomes invisible, when the midois become aroused. In order for the midas to be aroused, the moichin has to be hidden away. Why? Because when a person is busy involved in his moichin, he's mufshat from any emotional arousal, And as soon as there's emotional arousal, it overtakes the moichin. It doesn't allow the moichin to operate properly, really. So when a person's in a state of emotional arousal, he can't think properly, can't think straight. As we know, when a person has, unfortunately, terrible pseudos toivus and so on and so forth, let's say a person is in avelus, so it's very unwise for a person and immediately is in an avelus and so on to make any piskei dinim. Why? Why is he not allowed to make piskei din in them? Because he's in a state of emotional arousal, and therefore the psak is going to be not alpi seichel. It's going to be alpi hergish and midas and so on and so forth, and that would make the psak din unreliable. And there's many other such examples. So in any event, the kasher or moichim mer begiloi, yevshal yos is oris amida. When a person's deeply vertracht in an Indian sichli, busy thinking through something, you don't experience, he doesn't experience either the Indian of his midos. Kim kashem is alem oramoichim, but when the oramoichim becomes hidden away to some extent, as mis mida. In other words, one is a precondition for the other. The oramoichim has to be hidden in order for there to be his oiras amida. Ach his oiras amida hu mehabechein. But the midah itself is only misoyer, not from the etzem hamoichin, not from the etzem concept, but from the bechein. What's the bechein? The bechein, therefore, the bechein is, to say it in a word, the uvechein, and therefore. The therefore of the machshava, in other words, you have some kind of intellectual concept, and you say afterwards, given this intellectual concept the way it is, the way I understand it, therefore what's going to be, therefore what's the impact on me, therefore what's going to change, how's it going to change my life, that therefore is called the bechein, right? Uvechein, that's why it's called the bechein. The hainu mashikiras elokim loy toiv. The bechein, uvechein, and what's in it, what's it all about, what's the end result, that's got to do with kiras elokim li toiv. It's good for me. What's good for me is the bechein that is going to draw out of it. Right? But derech makif nirgash az elokus amashin is spoil. Nevertheless, there is bechinas makif. There's still the original seichel is still there in its mufshat form that caused him the sispilus. It's still there in a state of moichin, but it's not poil right now. What's poil now is the isoris amidas. That's what caused the midas in the first place to be bechinas hispilus. They call hispilus uchutz le'etzem. That hispilus is an outward thing. Hispilus means it's an outward movement from inside to out, and therefore, since it's an outward movement, it's an chitzonius thing, so to speak. Therefore, it's chutz mina etzem. Etzem is not in a state of hispilus. Etzem is a state of dveikus, and hispilus and dveikus don't go together, right? Okay. And this is exactly what it explains. When a person is in a state of hispilus, he moves away from his etzem inyan. Now, is hispilus a bad thing? No. We'll see soon that it's actually necessary. But he's going to explain weiter. In other words, he's in the inyan, he's bebechinas dveikus, and it's not shaykh for him to be in a state of emotional arousal. That's called dveikus, right? That inyan of dveikus sichli, that's dveikus. His pilus is something else. His pilus is an inyan in midois, and that's bebechinas richuk from the etzem. Okay, he continues. Even if the person is not experiencing complete his achdus in his state of dveikus, he's bothered with and bothered is the wrong word. Preoccupied. He's preoccupied with the etzem hadavar. It's not shaykh the inyan of his pilus when a person is in a state of dveikus or when he's tarud in the etzem machshava. Right, he's trying to figure something out, trying to work it out, trying to understand it, and so on and so forth. Sugya in the Gemara, or whether it's in the Hasidus, or whether even in a secular sense, if a person is preoccupied with the intellectual part of it, the emotional aspects of his being are in a state of rest, in a state of not being aroused. If a person has his pilus, it's because he moves away from the etzem ha'inyan, right? into midos. By midos, haram bechinas ispilus. So the midos are ispilus mashay kana moicha. Midos haram bechinas ispilus mispil al elokus. And why is it? Because it's possible to come to ispilus because you're not in the etzem. Befrat mashay midos roitze ba kiruv ba dveikus beelokush ye gilu benafshoy or bechinas tzimoyin chulo. You can only feel thirst for something when it's far away from you. You only feel longing for something when it's somewhat far away from you. That's when you want the gilu. That's when you want the oil in your neshama. That's when you're thirsty. When you're in a land, a dry land, a desert, that's when you get thirsty. Right? In other words, when there's no gilu of elokus, but when a person is davuk to elokus in his moichin, then it's full of oil. It's not an in of tzimoyan over there. It's an in of dveikus, a whole different thing. The mechinus hakiruv, I recall the enoshayach klal, or this whole inyan of tzimoyan, thirst for something, longing for something. Tamal chanavshi is not shaykh at all. But there klal yesh hefres now. All right, now he's going to explain that even in moichin there's a difference between chokhmah and bina. There's for sure a difference between moichin and midas, as we just explained. But even in moichin, there's a difference between chokhmah and bina. Chokhmah is the etzma inyan, and bina is the hasogas inyan. The difference between Abba and Ima, like the way the thing is by in Chochma is beginas bitul, who levada who ve'enzu lasa b'zoi madrekas Chochma, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya and Periklamet Hey in the Hagor. Masha'en came bina is already em habonim, right? She's already shayach to the bonim, which is Ava and Yira, even though she's the shorish of Ava and Yira, but nevertheless she's shayach to that inyan. ובדרך כלל יש הפרש במויכין גם כן, שזהו הפרש בין חוכמה לבינה. בבינה הוא בכנס איספילוס והיסלאבוס. Bina is the Indian of Ispilus. Now, it's not Ispilus Amidas, it's Ispilus Hamoichin, but nevertheless, it's Ispilus. Ispilus meaning that it's not the Etzem HaInyan. It's already moved outside of the Etzem. Right? Whereas Chochma hu b'chashai dafka. Chochma is in a state of chashai, meaning silence, in a state of silence. Who was it that used to say, I think it was the Mittler Rebbe, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was the Mittler Rebbe that used to say when he was, even when there was absolute silence in the room, he would say, Shah, 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 Shah. Why would he say that? In other words, be quiet, be quiet. Why would he say that? To still the Nevius HaMoichin, in order to still the activity going on in his mind so that he could grasp the Etzem HaInyan and not move away from it. So he would say, Shah, Shah. Right, and would in order to quieten himself, so to speak. Let me just see if there's anything in the chat. No one in the chat. All right, if there's anything, since we're a small group over here, if there are any questions or anything, you can unmute yourself. Otherwise, we'll leave time afterwards for questions. Okay, you do a hefresh ben kohanim and levim. This is the difference between kohanim and levim. Why? Because kohanim, their avoid is bechasha, in silence. A Kohen, when he goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, doesn't talk, he doesn't say anything, right? Even when he's in the Kodesh, he doesn't say anything. The avoid of the Kohanim is b'chasha, right? He does his avoid in silence. Masha'enka and the Levim, their avoid is singing and raising up their voices and so on and so forth. And the Levim were the choir, right? The avoid is the Kohanim b'chasha b'ru'usa de liba. It's in silence and in the arousal of the heart. In the arousal of the heart, when we say ru'usa de liba, we don't mean the arousal of the heart in the midos, we mean the arousal of the heart in ratzoin. It's an inyan of the ahava of ratzoin. It's ru'usa de liba is the ahava of ratzoin that he spoke about before, not the ahava of midos, where he's margishas atzmo, right? Ru'usa de liba is the ahava in ratzoin. V'avodas haLevim hu la'aramakala. The inyan of the Levim is to lift up their voices with a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and song and so on and so forth. That's the inyan of the Levim. And we know the difference between Levim and Kohanim. Kohanim is the inyan of Chesed, and Levim is the inyan of, essentially the inyan of Gvura compared with the Kohanim. Why is that important? Because the Kohen is the etzema inyan. Masha Enka and the Levim is already a tzimtzum. The inyan of Gvurois is the inyan of tzimtzum. And that's why they were able to express these inyonim on the outside. Masha Enka and the Kohanim were silent. Hanefesh ben chochma, is bittel mamish, difference between chochma, bittel, is bina, shuinyan asoga. And bina is grasp, intellectual grasp of things. Yesh umetzias. Bina is to a certain extent the inyan of yesh, the inyan of metzias. Now, when we say the beginning is yesh, it's not yesh in the sense of ego, but there's something there, right? In other words, it's the person in a state of bina is not in a state of complete dveikus lamaila. It's havona. Havona and asog is already from a distance. When the classical moshol that's used to explain this is like if there's a lightning flash, right? The lightning flash is like the in and the chokhmah. It lights up everything all at once, and then you have to reconstruct what you saw in that moment of bright light of that lightning flash. You're in a dark forest and you want to get out. You have to now reconstruct what you saw when the lightning flashed, and you saw for a moment. You saw the path out of there. Now you have to reconstruct that in your mind. That's bina. The reconstruction of the original flash, that's bina. The original flash is chokhmah. The reconstruction thereof is bina, and therefore bina is a tzimtzum legabe chokhmah. And it can be called legabe chokhmah the in of yesh metzias masha. And chokhmah is the in of kochma, the in of bittul, complete bittul. Omnan moichin bechlal hen begin is bittul. But we spoke about now the difference between chokhmah and bina. But generally, moichin in general, compared with midois, is the in of bittul as opposed to yeshus. The in of midois is for sure yeshus because it's hargoshus atzmoi. He feels himself. He's aware of himself. It's sort of a self. Puts himself in the picture. How does this impact me? How is this good for me? What's it gonna do to me? That's a midois inyan mashayin kain seichel. Even if we're talking about bina, compared with midois, it's much more abstract and mufshat and not limited in the same way. That's the inner moichin in general. Masha and midois are the inner bispilus, emotional arousal, and it's murgash. You can feel it in the heart, so to speak. It's yesh umetzias, the inner yesh umetzias. Dafnun zayin for anyone who's on the looking at their sefer. So we are now on Dafnun zayin. V'hine ba'avoda nun zayin in the old print. Nun zayin in the old print is actually ayin, the bottom of ayin gimel in the new print. Towards the bottom of ayin gimel in the new print. Okay, let's go weiter. V'hine ba'avoda behechech shia midas ahava b'hizgalus halev. As I said before, the Rebbe is going to tell us over here, the Rebbe Rashav is going to tell us over here that don't think that you'll just stick to Moichin and the Inyan of Dveikus and so on and so forth. Yeah, it's all fine and dandy, and it's absolutely necessary to have the Inyan of Dveikus and Makshova and Moichin in a general sense, but it's not going to do the tikkun that's necessary. It's not going to fix the issues. For that, you need Ahav and Yireh b'Hizgalus Halev. You need love and fear, awe of Hashem, in a revealed manner in the heart. Why? Because that has an impact on how you do the mitzvahs. Bepoil mamish has an impact on how you do your mitzvahs. Ava is the makor, the source of mitzvahs aseh. In other words, you go and do things out of love. You do things that your beloved wants, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and mitzvahs lo saseh, you refrain from doing things that he doesn't want you to do. That's a mitzvahs lo saseh. That's the in of yira. So that's ava and yira. Someone who fulfills the mitzvahs, the 248 positive commandments, and so on. That's the inyan of yesh mishu ohev. But nevertheless, that's the inyan of ahava. It's the inyan of midos. A Mekayim Be'emes, someone who fulfills these mitzvahs is because he has ahava in his heart. Yes, it can come from Kabbalah soul and various other things, but someone who does a be'emes is doing it out of love for Kodesh Baruch. Not only is it necessary in terms of the inyan of the mitzvah, is that it brings you to do the inyan of mitzvahs lo sase, ahava ben yira, but furthermore, it has another effect, the inyan of ahava ben yira, and that is it causes zichu biru the nefesh bahamis. Where did the nefesh bahamis come from ultimately? Ultimately, the source of the nefesh bahamis is in the shrius hakelim of olam hatoyu. Now, that's a very long distance back, but that's the whole inyan that olam hatikun, after the shrius hakelim, everything after the shrius hakelim is basically the inyan of tikkun. We're trying to do tikkun. So how can you have the inyan of tikkun if you only stick with moichi? You have to have the inyan of midos, because what? Where was the shvira in olam hatoyu? In the midos, right? From chesed down. There was no shvira in the moichi. There was no shvira in chokhmah and bina. So therefore, in order to massacre in the shvira, which was in the midos, chesed wurde teferet enzach od yesod, malchus. Malchus is only partially broken. In order to be able to do that, so there has to be an inyan of his galus ahava v'yira belay, because that's going to be misaka and it's going to do the tikkun. And he's going to explain a bit further. With intellectual exercise alone, intellectual effort alone, you're not divorced from your nefesh bahamis. You're not divorced from your nefesh bahamis yet. Just through intellectual, the nefesh bahamis just lies there dormant. It hasn't been rectified yet. In order to get away from the chumris of the nefesh bahamis, the coarse physicality and materiality of the nefesh bahamis, they can only come through ahava and yira, as I'll explain. But if a person's avodah is milamala lamata, in other words, if the avodah that this person essentially gets a matona milamala, gets a gift from above, then such a person doesn't have to necessarily work on inyonim milamata lamaila, because he got everything that he got milamala lamata. Now, this is very unusual. It's sometimes called matnas kahuna. It's the gift that is given to tzaddikim, great tzaddikim. The gifts of the priest, but the gifts of that are given to tzaddikim. For whatever reason, they're given these inyonim, but it's l'mayla mihamidois, and they don't have to make an effort to mevarer their midois in the way that the vast majority of us do. Right? It's a matona that was given to them because they have very lofty neshomas, and therefore they don't need to do. The tikkun was already done in a previous Gilgul, or they didn't have to do it in the first place, or whatever. Okay. Kim ala the avoida, where's the tikkun? Ala the avoida, the ava yira dafka, through the avoida of ava and yira. That's where getting rid of the chumriyos of the nefesh bahamas comes in. Through the avoida of ava and yira. Ki nefesh bahamas yikaro hu midas. The ikar in the nefesh bahamas is not seichel. Yes, the seichel of the nefesh bahamas also, but that's not its ikar. Its ikar is the midos. And the tikkun of midos is, as we said, that comes about through his galus of ahava and yira. All came gambi slapshus and nefesh elokis, but nefesh bahamis. When the nefesh elokis is melubash and the nefesh bahamis, it's clothed in the nefesh bahamis. Ikaru b'chinas midas. The ikar inyan of that the nefesh elokis is doing there is to mevara the midas. In other words, to work on the midos, sheboy, the midos that are in the person. And this is how it brings about the birur and the tikkun of the nefesh bahamis, the rectification of the nefesh bahamis, the birur, the clarification, and so on. Even if a person is on a level of dveikus, in other words, he thinks very deeply into things to such an extent it gets completely lost in the inyan, can be lost there for even for several days. It can happen, right? The person can be lost in an inyan moichin, and therefore Yachol Yoshe Churmas and Nefesh Bahamas who become B'Takvoyadain. He's still in a place of his Nefesh Bahamas is still there. You know the story of the Alter Rebbe and the son of the Maggid Mizrish Avraham. They were busy being misboinen. They were learning some Inyan and Makava, and they were misboinen on some very high Inyanim. And the Alter Rebbe felt that Rabbi Avraham, the son of the Maggid, was about to like float away forever, right? So he stuck a piece of bagel, in his mouth, and he brought him back that way, right? He brought him back to his Nefesh Bahamis. Although Nefesh Bahamis that the Malach had, that Rabbi Avraham had, I'm sure we would belong to have such a Nefesh Bahamis. In any event, so Yachal Yosh Chumri is the Nefesh Bahamis. Al Kopanim is Guf. Let's put it that way. Not his Nefesh Bahamis. He was already a tzaddik. So Mela Hargo Betainis. The Nefesh Bahamis even becoming Betokvadain, and the rest of us, the Nefesh Bahamis is there in its full glory and its full strength. But when there's love and awe in the revealed manner in the heart, Poel Chalishus, with the Nefesh Bahamis, that causes weakness in the Nefesh Bahamis. Shenechlash Chumriusai, that the Chumris, the materiality of the Nefesh Bahamis, the Chitzonius, the Klippa, the shallowness of the Nefesh Bahamis is weakened by the Inyan of Av and Yira. And through Avoida, a person is able to nullify the Chumrius, the physical dimension of the Nefesh Bahamis, the Murgash, the feeling of self of the Nefesh Bahamis. It's not good enough to just be involved in Avodas HaMoichin. This is one of the arguments that there was between Hasidim and Misnagdim. Misnagdim were very involved in Avodas HaMoichin, and they did a good job of it in general, Avodas HaMoichin. But since it didn't come into the Inyan, that Avodas HaMoichin was not mashpia on Av and Yira, therefore they didn't really do all that much of a tikkun. And these things still had to be rectified later on. Nevertheless, there's a tremendous advantage of the Gilui in Moichin because it's oir and it's on a higher madrega than the Indian Midois. You see amongst the Chagat, what they call the Chagas Chasidim, that their Ike Indian is his oir salev. And with Chabad, it's more an Indian of Moichin. Now, what's the difference? The difference is that a person can get stuck in the Indian of Midois. In other words, the Indian of Midois, because it's Olam HaToyu, it comes from Olam HaToyu, it's very intense and it's very compelling, and therefore a person can stay in that without doing the proper tikkun. One needs the Indian of Seichel in order to bring the midos into the proper alignment, so to speak. Since the moichin is the Indian of bittul, meir bahem gilu oir. It's oir in the moichin. Excuse me. Since the midos are in of metzius, their material existence means ma'id bahem or the or is reduced. She'ena meir bahem agilu klal. Because the Indian is the Indian of midos is a much reduced oir, and mashenka and moichin. All right, they don't have nearly the same level of gilui. All right, so let's just do the kitzer. Kitzer, we have a hinal. His lapshus oir is bekalim. Harim bechinis his chalkus the malumata. It's true that the oil becomes malubish in the kalim, so you get different gradations in the oil depending on which kli it went into. Kochos hanefesh, and as we see in kochos hanefesh, kochos chochma, she askola, which is the kuda mufshetes adain, that it's a mufshat, stripped away from any practical inyonim and emotions and so on and so forth. It's an akuda mufshetes. That's in the moichin. And therefore, meir ba dakus etzimor. Therefore, the essential light, as it is meir in chokhmah. As we said before in the Hago and Tanya, hu levada hu ve'enzulaso zoim yadrekas chokhmah. That's madrega of chokhmah. Okay, the Indian of etzimor. V'kach habina shiyasoga harihima lemes al or shebchokhmah. It has to conceal that original enlightenment of chokhmah in order to get it into intellectual thought categories. When it is a tamtzis meir dakus etzema or aval hu b'murgash, the tamtzis inyan, that's the essential point of Chokhmah is that's called an Akuda Hatantis. So the Etzem Ha'or is mayor there. But it's mayor in a way that's mugash. In other words, you can get a hint of it. You can feel it to a certain extent in Chokhmah. Feel is the wrong word, but you get a sense of it. Whereas v'hamido is an hergesh asmoy, but the midah is a feeling of self, not a feeling of the etzem inyan. L'chein bayin on the das tafka. That's why they come down to the das. Chokhmah bin a das. V'ava atzmius. Sorry, v'ava atzmius ain't a midah kim ratzoin. Whereas ava atzmius, like we said before, that's a quality in ratzoin. It's not a quality in midos. We spoke about this earlier. He wants and he desires and he loves that which is etzem and mahus. Whereas the midah who sheroitze rak mashetov loy. A person wants what's good for me. That's the inyan of ahava. Therefore, the difference between the midas in ratz and the midas in midos is that the midah grabs hold of the metzius, in other words, the existential quality of the midah. Whereas ratzon grasps the etzem inyan, right? Ratzon grabs the etzem inyan. Is so too in a ruchnistic sense. You can have ratzon without ahava, as we explained previously. The fact that midos descend from moichin, that's the midos that are in moichin, that descend from the level of moichin. As the midos are in moichin, that's called hergesh etzem hatoiv. He feels the goodness, right? He's aware of the goodness. Whereas in the midos hergesh haloi toiv. We feel what's good for me, not the good, but the good for me. As we said before, that's the inyan. It says in the pasuk, the closest to God is good for me. Therefore, the midos are only aroused after moichin is no longer being poiled. The midos are in a state of ispalus, and therefore the light in the midos is in a state of reduction because it's hergish. And moichin also, the ikar bittul of moichin is in chokhmah, because that's the inyan of bittul. But nevertheless, we still need, it's not good enough just to have moichin, even if it's chokhmah. We still have to have the inyan of midos. Why? Because midos beis galus, haleiv or masaken and nefesh ha-bahamis. Person fulfills the mitzvahs, and that is also leads to the tikkun of the nefesh bahamis when it's put in its place and it's told what it has to do, and it's led by the nefesh elokis, by the inyanim of Torah mitzvahs. Okay, if there are any questions, I will take some questions. If not, then we can call it a day. Where is? Where's the chat? Here it is. All right, if anyone wants to unmute themselves, they can unmute. Otherwise, you can type in the chat if you have any questions. Of course, if there are no questions, don't worry about it. We'll meet next week. All right, doesn't look like there are any questions, so I will see you all, Bezos Hashem, next week. All tov.